Talking together, we were able to create a kind of consciousness among ourselves. And I think we realized a rebellion is an outburst of anger. But it's not revolution. Revolution is evolution towards something much grander in terms of what it means to be a human being.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Public Service called Lesson Plans. Today, I'll be moderating the conversation. My name is Jaffer Kolb. I am the director of an architectural practice in New York called New Affiliates. And we're joined today, very excited, by Heather Fleming and Deanna Van Buren, both of whom I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm really happy to engage you in conversation. So the focus of the conversation today is both on the projects that you do, but also how designers might be able to kind of get involved with work on the ground and use both financial and like other mechanisms that we encounter every day to sort of do innovative and sort of what I would call brilliant work to create more justice and equality in the world that we're surrounded by. So I thought we would begin today, maybe by means of an introduction, Deanna and Heather, both to talk a little bit about your beginnings and how your prior experiences led you to the work you do. Deanna as an architectural designer, Heather as a design consultant, and then maybe talk a little bit about your respective projects, DJDS for Deanna and Change Labs for Heather.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Heather, and I am currently the executive director of Change Labs on the Navajo Nation. We're headquartered in Tuba City, which is where I also was born, on the res, largest town on Navajo. And I grew up in a very rural pocket of New Mexico on the eastern edge of the reservation. And even as a little kid, I could recognize, I guess, injustice without knowing what it was called or having a name for it. And that was because my house where I grew up was technically a mile or so off the reservation, but my relatives and some of my friends from school and family members lived, on the other side of this invisible border that was a mile away. And because they were on that side and I was on this side, they didn't have a lot of basic necessities like running water or electricity. It wasn't a guarantee. Whereas I had all those things because I wasn't technically on the reservation. I think my career direction was inspired by that observation, but also my cousin. Her name is Jeannie Abushan, and she was working for the Indian Health Service as a civil engineer. And I remember one day in particular, she took me to work with her. And she showed me this well that she was working on out near, I think it was like Kinlachi in Arizona. And I just thought it was really cool that she was solving this problem that I couldn't really articulate very well, but I just saw that she was visiting these families and they had running water. And I thought it was neat that, I've had that my whole life and now other folks are just getting it. She was a civil engineer. So I went to college. She was a big part of that, pushing me to go to college. And I thought I wanted to be a civil engineer just like her, because I had this idea that engineers were humanitarians. And then I got there and realized that's not how most people view engineers, that it's very technical. There's lots of math and physics, that they barely talk about people. But that in itself led me to another engineering program. I studied at Stanford, and their product design program is all about problem solving. It's combining engineering with art and psychology and design to think about how do we identify problems and how do we identify people impacted by those problems, and how do we design solutions, physical or systems, that can change people's behaviors. And I took to that, I think, like a fish to water. And jumping the gun a little bit, a few years after graduating, 6 or so, I founded my first company, Catapult Design. And it took me all over the world, primarily East Africa and India. But what I learned from that was that there's all these amazing pockets around the world that look just like the Navajo Nation back at home. But, you know, these rural towns in East Africa where people were making solutions, they were building companies, they were social entrepreneurs and social ventures. And I was like, wow, we have these same problems on Navajo. How come no one's solving the problems? Why don't we have entrepreneurs? Why don't we have makers? And that's kind of what led me to my work at Change Labs. Is I've always wanted to figure out a way to come back home, but I could never figure out how to do that because there's no jobs on the reservation. There's no markets. There's no buildings. There's many places don't even have roads or water, electricity. So I couldn't figure out how I could live there again. So, but Change Labs kind of was my way of taking everything that I had learned as a kid and everything that I had learned through just working with all these amazing social entrepreneurs and ventures at Catapult Design and saying, like, how can I cross-pollinate? How can I bring some of these amazing ideas back home to the reservation? And how do I support and build a community of local entrepreneurs that can activate all of that? So yeah, that's my path.
Well, thank you for that, Heather. I love hearing people's stories. Some similarities for me between us. I was, mine kind of started in just understanding the conditions of Black folks in America within the context of a lot of our social structures and systems. You know, my family desegregated a community in rural Virginia in the 70s. So we were kind of in the wake of Jim Crow. There's a lot of hostility around that. And then a kind of lessons being taught to me by my father and just being seen that the justice system as part of all of this was not something that was fair to Black and brown folks and that I should stay out of it, stay away from it. So the messaging was clear. The experience of that was clear. And so I think my strategy was to comfort myself by building spaces for myself that were little huts in the forest or in the home. Like I was literally using architecture to psychologically self-soothe within the context of an environment that was pretty hostile. And, you know, when you're a young person and you perceive the world as not being safe, and it wasn't that safe, you know, you find ways to comfort yourself. So it was not a surprise. I did go to become an architect. I kind of knew about the age of 12 that I wanted to be one consciously. And, you know, I went to school and much of my experience in school was not dissimilar to what I experienced in life, right? A lot of racism within the context of the academy. A lot of sexism in the context of the academy. And my approach in life was like, well, I just have to get through it, right? I got to get through this. And despite some questions I was asking, like when I was at Columbia about like, why are we designing blobs? Why are we building cities in China? I'm not from China. I don't know anything about it. But what I know is that Harlem's not looking so good. Why are we not working within communities that we're adjacent to? And was really always kind of push back, right? That like, oh, you're at the wrong school. Nobody's going to do that. So there was always this kind of a way that I was accepting the context of this architectural environment, but still questioning it. And not unlike Heather, I went overseas and I worked overseas for about 6 years. Also went to East Africa, was traveling through South America, working in the Middle East, living in Europe. I lived in Australasia, was doing projects in Malaysia and China, Thailand. And what I was seeing was a lot of those same things. People didn't have running water. Tribes were traveling on foot to just get medicine for their children. And I was working for the 1% at the same time, super wealthy developers, some of the richest people in the world. And this juxtaposition of wealth, right? And I think, Jaffer, you're wish we could hear your story too. Maybe we can, of this patronage, like this model, business model of how we serve and who we serve. And I'm looking at how most of the world is living. And it was hard to reconcile that as an architect. Like, what am I doing here? Right? There's nobody who looks like me in these rooms. We are not asking questions of equity, like, why are we building on this land? People are living on this land. What's going to happen to those people? No questions. Like, there was just no question in the industry and the profession about what we were doing and how we were doing it. So when I came back to the US in 2005, I saw the public interest design movement was emergent. It was like the early 2000s, like Architecture for Humanity and public architecture. And I started to be able to see a way out of this corporate condition and wanted to do that kind of practice, and started to hear about other regenerative systems that were possible within the context of what I had been taught by my father, the criminal justice system. And I'd learned about restorative justice at that time, and decided that that was something that I was going to commit my life to. I was going to design spaces for restorative justice, not really knowing what that even meant. Maybe I still don't know what that means, but I was able to start to do that research. I was able to break away in 2011 and start my own practice. And within that time, started to learn. And ironically, it was for the Syracuse Peacemaking Center that I was working on, where the Navajo Nation was informing and developing peacemaking, helping to develop a peacemaking program in that community, training elders to moderate conflicts, diverting cases out of court. We did a lot of community engagement. We did a lot of site selection and design. And then there was no financing for the project. I go, what do you mean there's no financing for the project? Like, I spent all this time, we did all this work. And I realized in that moment that we could, architects are great, right? We can make the pretty pictures, but it doesn't matter. If you don't actually understand how the financing and infrastructure piece works, it doesn't matter. If you don't start to use that multidisciplinary approach to collaborate and take down actually systemic systems of oppression and the way the built environment manifests that, we're not going to really get very far. So designing justice, designing spaces came out of that as both a real estate development and architecture firm. And we do community engagement and research to begin to actually build the new models and prototypes that we need to be building, rather than serving the wealthy.
I think the meat of the conversation today is, of course, about the work that you're both currently doing. And I'd love you both to describe that work, from the day-to-day to the kind of like broad kind of big picture thinking. But maybe one step before we get there, and in line with your origin stories, I did want to ask a little bit more, maybe for our younger listeners, about what school was like, what architecture school or product design school was like.
I had a blast in school. I had never heard of product design as a degree before, but as a kid, I was always painting something, drawing something, building something. So, but I also knew that I was drawn to people challenges just based on my experiences as a kid. And I don't think I ever knew that there was a degree like that existed. So to find it or stumble upon it, I feel very lucky. And I know that I think it's not a common degree at a lot of universities still. But the type of classes I had were, I remember intro to psych, ethnography. I loved ethnography. We had photography classes where we learned about composition, and then all kinds of art classes, actually. And then, but I also had a bunch of math and physics class on the engineering side. And then a lot of classes, project-based classes, where we were just given a challenge, like the client would be target. And the problem was, how do we serve the needs of parents who are sending their kids off to college for the first time? How do we make that a comforting and memorable environment? And I remember one time I had to shadow a chef at a restaurant in San Francisco and try and design tools or systems that would make it easier for a kitchen to be in line and in sync and for orders to be delivered on time. I really like that sort of stuff, just thinking about learning about different people and what their problems are, and then working with them to try and come up with solutions. And it's 100% what I do now at Change Labs. I'll say that the one discouraging thing about school, though, is that, so I graduated in 2002 with a bachelor's degree. And at that time, I remember telling my my advisor that the type of design that I wanted to do, because at Stanford at that time, I think most people were trying to go work for IDEO or some other product design firm in the Bay Area, Frog Design or whatnot. But I didn't want to build those sorts of products. So similar to Deanna, I felt like, why would I go do that when there's all kinds of stuff going on the reservation? I wanted my senior thesis project, where what I pitched was that I would create this device that made it easier to transport water on the reservation, because that was really hard for my grandparents and my aunties and my uncles when I was a kid. They would take these giant oil barrels and they'd go out to the nearest water source. They'd pump in all the water. And then my job was to be in the back of the trunk and hold the lid down. But we would lose so much water just from the sloshing back and forth on the res roads. And I just thought there has to be a better way to do that. That's what I'm going to pitch for my senior thesis project. But I remember my advisor not letting me do that, because he said, your senior thesis project needs to represent the type of design that you want to do after graduation. And I said, well, that is the type of design I wanted to do. And he said something along the lines like, I'm sorry to tell you, but there's no market for that. So I ended up working on something that I didn't really even care about. I think it was like a child finder when you're at Disneyland. I was kind of scrambling to find something because they wouldn't let me do the type of design that was most meaningful to me. And that stuck with me for a long time. I didn't start Catapult right after college. I waited 6 years and I ended up I became just a consultant at one of the many Bay Area design firms. But that whole time I was just angry because I didn't want to be doing what I was doing. I remember my first project was for Craftsman, and it was like a toolbox with a radio in it. And I thought, okay, the world needs more of those. And I was just getting more and more angry every year that went by. And if you had known me when I was a kid or a high school or even in college, you would never have pegged me for someone who would start their own business. I was always been the introverted, quiet person in the back of the room. I don't like to be too loud. But I think at the end of the day, for me, I was just so mad that I couldn't do what I wanted to do. And I slowly realized that the only way to do it was if I just created that opportunity for myself. And that anger was enough to get me over that first hurdle. And I didn't know what I was getting into. So that helped too. Deanna, I'd love to hear about your design school experience.
Oh my God. Love that. Loving these stories. Yeah, I get the anger piece. And I don't see no one's listening to me and hearing me. I wish I'd done your degree program. Mine was heavy architecture, Bachelor of Science in Architecture, Masters of Architecture. I mean, this is the 90s too, right? I'm a little older than you. So this is the early to mid 90s. So I was in school from 1990 to 1996 in general. Or 99. Oh God, long time. So I was ignored. People just ignored me. That was kind of the primary, or told maybe I should try a different program. Why don't you go into music? Why don't you do this? So, but honestly, everybody was racist before that, right? So it wasn't like my experience in life in school was that's how I was going to get treated. So it wasn't different. It was what I expected. I just knew that I just had to finish it. What I really learned, right? I think going to these two different design schools, UVA and then to Columbia, if I just look at objectively outside of the ignoring, outside of that, the kind of education I got at UVA was very complementary to the kind of education I got at Columbia, because it was very conceptual. When people were like, Really, I was like, it's like I had to relearn design, but the two together really made me a much stronger designer. And you kind of have to just ignore the racism and sexism to some degree. I had to just ignore it and keep going. And I think the best class I ever took as undergrad was sociology. Right? It changed my life. Like it just changed everything. And then I took criminology, and then I took ethnic violence. I started, in the little tiny moments, they'd give me a chance to study what I really wanted to do. I never got to do a thesis, right? No one ever guided me or helped me to actually do the kind of projects I wanted to do. It took a while, right? Till later in life that I was able to do that. But I will say the design education I got was very robust and has really helped me moving forward, to be a design leader. So I'm grateful for that part.
I'm actually amazed at how well you both remember your undergraduate classes. I'm like scratching my head. I don't think I could name 4 classes I took as an undergrad. But you have better memories than me. So as I mentioned, I think the sort of meat of the conversation maybe today is the work that you both are currently doing at DJDS and Change Labs, and sort of maybe we start at the most big picture thinking, if you could both describe those 2 projects, and really a little bit about what led you to them, which I think we've gotten through your narratives a lot, but maybe even in a more immediate sense, what kind of business models you were looking to, if there were even other, like-minded organizations that you were looking at as a kind of precedent almost, like, maybe if I followed this model, but then I kind of substitute in some of the ingredients, I can do the work I want to do, or if you felt as though you had to invent it from scratch.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, when I first started my form design studio in 2011, which was my first firm, I'm reading company tax structures for dummies and I had no business plan or model. I think Jaffer was like, what's your business plan? I had no business plan. There was no plan. The plan was just to design for restorative justice. So I was started to look at what would a nonprofit infrastructure look like? I went to the Public Interest Design Institute that Brian Bell had started to do. I was looking at for-profit entities, B Corps. I mean, I was starting to feel like, well, what kind of model can I use for this business? And at the time, I was just a sole proprietorship for about 4 or 5 years. And what I was starting to see was that the way that the work that I wanted to do was getting funded was through philanthropic dollars. So, and that the philanthropic dollars allowed me to basically come up with my own ideas in collaboration with community, right? It wasn't coming out of a vacuum. And begin to implement projects. So an architect kind of operating as an artist, right? Like you start to generate ideas. You don't wait for something, an RFP, a competition, an institutional entity, or someone to tell you what needs to get done. You just lead it. And that model, the nonprofit model, turned out to be the right way to start a firm. So that was a decision that I made. And since then, we actually have set up a hybrid company tax structure. So we are a nonprofit that owns a for-profit blocker that under that are the individual LLCs, which works for our business because we are both redoing real estate and architecture. And so it's those projects need to be their own entity for various reasons, and they can take investment and do all of that. So it started to become like, I'm not interested in this one model of generating revenue and operating. We need to actually have multiple sources of revenue and begin to diversify the revenue stream. So, because architecture, real estate is just expensive. And we're working for communities that have been under-resourced for centuries. So we need all the money we can get.
And maybe, Deanna, before we move on, can you talk a bit more about what DJDS does, the types of projects? I mean, I know them personally, but just maybe for listeners, you mentioned restorative justice, of course. And what are the actual physical or, conceptual things that come out of your practice?
Yeah. Well, it's very vast. So I won't name all of it. It's like a huge range in scale from products to CD plan ideas, right? So this multi-scalar nature of the work is important for the mission of ending. When you want to use design to address whole systems change, you can't limit yourself to one piece. But a lot of the work we do, one example of it, I should say, are restorative reinvestments in communities that have been impacted by typically mass incarceration. And that would involve us supporting them on either purchasing a piece of infrastructure, a building like Restore Oakland, which is a project we have in Oakland, where I live. It's the country's first center for restorative justice and restorative economics. So we help them locate the building. We negotiate the purchase and sale agreement on the building. Sometimes we'll even help building out the capital stack, right? Where's the money coming from? Getting all the financial modeling in place. And then we'll engage them in the design and the implications of that. And we'll do full architectural services. So there's a full service piece there. So now we have a collection of organizations who own their building, right? So this is the restorative economics piece. These are a collection of groups who now can build, right? They can grow. And then this building, they can implement restorative justice practices, which is happening. They have trainings every week. So we're building a new cultural arm and muscle in a way of doing justice, and the space anchors and foments that. The kitchen is the largest fine dining training kitchen in the country that trains low-wage restaurant workers to get living wage jobs in fine dining. They're working with socially engaged artists, so the building becomes a platform for arts and culture representation. They're incubating small food businesses there. Right. So, and it's the headquarters for community organizing. So they're able to use their space to have night markets and celebrations for undocumented workers. And you can go there if you're you're fighting your landlord, right? So it's this multi-use justice hub that addresses the multiple aspects from the food ecosystem, criminal justice system, all of that in one building. So those are the kinds of projects we like to do. And it's important that communities own their stuff. Right. So trying to get to that. So that's an example of one. And we have others just like it around the country.
And Heather, same question.
Yeah. Change Labs. We're a Native led and Native controlled. We're a nonprofit organization out in Tuba City. And we support local entrepreneurs, artisans, vendors, business owners, nonprofit leaders with realizing their ideas and building their ideas, growing their ideas. And that's usually in the form of incubator support and also financing. We have a kinship-based lending program, which is more or less a character-based lending program that we run at Change Labs. And then we also provide workspace for entrepreneurs through currently we have one workspace in Tuba City, and then we're trying to expand to 6 other communities on Navajo. And then there's the policy aspect of it too. The reason that we focus on entrepreneurs at Change Labs is, I guess it's twofold. If you've ever driven across the res on your way to the Grand Canyon or Lake Powell or Mesa Verde, in our most prominent res towns, you'll see Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, maybe a hotel, Chevron gas station. But what you don't see are any local businesses. And there's a reason for that. I think the second thing is what I realized. I didn't even know all this stuff, and I grew up there, but a lot of the laws that govern the Navajo Nation were created back in the 1920s when more or less the US government kind of created our government for us. And a lot of the laws work against people creating and growing businesses because at the time there was the Mineral Leasing Act that was going on, and all of these big companies wanted to come to tribal land so they could mine for uranium and coal and oil and all that stuff. So the laws were drafted to give those opportunities to large corporations. And the results of that is, as a small business owner trying to start or grow a business on the reservation, you operate by a completely different set of rules that would govern the state of New Mexico or Arizona. And that's why when you drive across the reservation, you don't see any local businesses. You don't see local tourism companies or even food vendors. They're all stuck in the flea markets, or you'll see them on the side of the road selling chopped wood or coal or battery recycling service. They're just doing it out of the back of their truck because of the way that our treaties were drafted and the way that our government was constructed. back in the day, and there has been no change to those policies in that time period. The downside of all that is that there is no local economies. Everybody goes shopping in the border towns. So I think according to the last study, which is now 10 years old, 65 cents of every dollar earned on the reservation is spent off the reservation. So we're not retaining any of that wealth in our communities. And that is what most people associate, I think, with native lands, is poverty and lack of opportunity. And even folks like me, we're told by our leaders that we need to educate ourselves and then come home. But once you get an education, you're cut off from coming home. There's no jobs. And if you don't want to start a business, then you can't come back to the reservation. There's nothing for you to do. I know so many diaspora Navajos that have the same story as myself, and we want to come home, but we can't. So our thinking with Change Labs is how do we help people leapfrog some of the obstacles that were put in place, a century ago that work against us? How do we address some of the cultural barriers around starting a business? So many of the members of our incubator network feel like they are working against their culture or their tribe because they're trying to start a business. Because so many people in our communities have these negative connotations of an entrepreneur or business owner. They had early experience with white traders who, took advantage of them. And I still feel like some people consider an entrepreneur, they're not a good person if you're trying to run a business. So we have these cultural stigmas that we're working around. Access to finance is a whole big bucket just because we have very few banks on the reservation. It's very rural and remote. So in my mind, entrepreneurs have almost everything working against them. And yet we have so many social challenges that our people can be addressing if they could actually create the businesses to address them. And we have so many problems to solve. It's kind of overwhelming at times, but I would say that Change Labs is really focused on the doers and the makers and the change makers, the creative people out there who want to figure out some of these challenges. We want to support them, make sure they have the funding that they need, the support that they need, and that we can work with them to attempt to change some of these policies that work against them.
I wanted to maybe pick up on a couple through lines from your last 2 points, Heather and Deanna. Heather, you talked a lot about the kind of like the locality, the idea of the local economy. And I wanted to maybe hear from both of you a little bit. I'm trying to avoid framing this as a kind of like expansionist capitalist ethos where it's like all about getting bigger and growing and looking outward. But maybe how do you both consider problems of the local, the regional, and the global? I thought it was interesting in both of your personal narratives that you traveling caused you both to look back on the context you were coming from and try and import models that could maybe be brought back. So there is this kind of idea of trying to like learn from the world around us, I guess. But to what degree do you think it's super important to be working in your two hyper-local conditions? Deanna, you've talked about, of course, all the work you do in Oakland a lot, which is so inspiring and amazing. Do you consider these models that could be then projected outwards away from the geographic areas that you're working in? Do you consider that yet? Or does it feel like maybe just focusing on the present is more important?
So I can share, Jaffer. We actually aren't local based in the way Heather is. We are nationally focused and always have been, because our work is not possible unless we have local folks who are deeply connected to the community, wanting to innovate in the space. So we've had to go wherever we could go to get the prototypes built because the partnerships were right and the conditions were right. It's very hard to make something happen when you have intractable people or folks who don't have capacity, or, so that's how we started. I mean, the first project I did, second project I did was in Syracuse, New York. So I was flying across the country, taking 2 planes to get there to do that project. But it was hugely impactful and we learned and were able to replicate. So I think the way that we're doing that is always a constant discussion in our practice, because you have to build trust. So I would say there are parts of the country that we're focused on, right? We're doing a lot of work in Detroit. I've been going there for years and years and really building relationships on the ground slowly, so there's ways that we need to do that. But I will say we are starting to do more work when you say locally, like California, because it's just easier, it's closer and easier. But we've never, like, there are people in Oakland that don't know us and discovered us yesterday because they didn't know that we were here, because we've just been focused on where we can make the most change.
I would say that at Change Labs, we have constant discussions with members of our community on how they define success and wealth, and that inherently ties to how they think about growth and how we at Change Labs think about growth too. And I kind of came into it a little bit crippled, in the sense that maybe you guys won't see it as being crippled, but I when I went off to college, I was in Silicon Valley for about 18 years. So I was just immersed in this environment where it was kind of icky at times, kind of amazing, because there's just sort of this entrepreneurial, you can do it buzz. Everyone's building companies. And I feel like I absorbed that by osmosis to some degree. But then I do remember having conversations where I was kind of just aghast at, a company, social media being sold for billions of dollars. That feels icky to me. And it wasn't until I got back to the reservation, and I think initially I'll admit that I was thinking like the Navajo Nation could be its own little micro Silicon Valley. And it took a while to beat that type of thinking out of me, that maybe that's not the best model. Maybe the things that I felt icky about are an underpinning that, or is a signal that doesn't need to be replicated, and is only in conversations with our members and my incredible team members that I work with that I learned that scale isn't necessarily a good thing, at least from an Indigenous perspective. And if we look back at our way of being, at least for Navajos, it's all rooted in this idea of balance and beauty. There's a word for it. We call it hojo. So in that way, the way that you live your life is not this, growth at all costs, forward progress. It's about sustaining, nurturing, regenerating, achieving balance. And a lot of our business owners bring that mindset into their businesses. So they don't have ambitions to just, exit strategies or just growth for growth's sake. It really is about solving problems. I don't even know if it's about that so much, but benefiting communities, improving their family life, but just enough so that you're making an impact, but there's no need to be excessive. And in fact, that excess is considered bad. And I think there's a lot that the US economy could learn from that mindset and from our concept of hojo. But I know for me as the executive director, when I'm talking to organizations who are interested in our work or want to invest in Native entrepreneurs, I have to reset their expectations about what they're going to find here. That yes, we may have a few entrepreneurs here and there who are interested in that, but the majority of them feel like that's counter to their way of life. And so if you're looking for a unicorn on the Navajo Nation, you may not find it, for not just because of our resource constraints, but because of the way that we think about the world.
Heather, you put it so beautifully. Like, it's always such a struggle. And I work with on this with my students a lot, which is at what points do kind of critiques of capitalism put us in this weird position where we're trying to deny people the ability to grow and expand because we frame those as a kind of like Western colonialist mentality, versus at what point are we trying to find this kind of generous balance? And I think, understanding it as a balance is such a fantastic way of putting it, and I'll hold on to that. The two things I wanted to ask are, one, a kind of more generic question, which is, what advice do you have for young people who want to do something similar to you? I honestly think both of you gave really compelling kind of versions of that through talking about your stories. The second one actually had to do weirdly with like personal or individual empowerment. I think in both of your organizations, this idea of the kind of toolbox, I think, and I'm sorry if I misrepresent either of your work at all, but at Change Labs, this idea of the kind of incubator, navigating bureaucratic processes, like how do you get a business like off the ground? And Deanna, and I think in your work, there actually is this idea of the do tank and the idea of like the kind of toolkit towards restorative justice and the kind of conceptual approach to starting a kind of programmatic analysis early on. So I just wanted to hear maybe, and we could end with this if you're interested in talking about it, like how fundamental to the work you do is not just a broad vision about design and how design can kind of service humanity, but also how toolboxes, toolkits, and personal empowerment can take that from the bottom up at the same time.
I mean, there's the toolkit piece, which for us is just a way, like buildings take a long time to build, right? So every project we do has got to be amplified. And our theory of change is that we ideate with community, we build the prototype in relationship with a usually strong program providers, we evaluate that, and then we replicate, right? And replication involves sharing out of all our IP to people so they can do it too. And toolkits are a great way to do that, to just get the work out there and help people be able to do DIY it to some degree. So we do a lot of that stuff. The empowerment piece, for me, when I hear empowerment, or I hear like how to, if I had a message for students too, I say it all the time, you've got to do your own inner healing work, right? You have to, it's more than just, we talk about work and we tend to not actually talk about the whole person and especially with BIPOC community, we're dealing with a lot of trauma. It has to be addressed. So there's a sort of responsibility one has to really go inner and do that, so that when they go out in the world to do the work, they themselves are healed and can contribute towards healing. And I think all actions that we are taking on the planet, whatever you do, whether you're a grocer, whether you're an architect, whether you're a politician, needs to be an agency of healing the planet, healing ourselves, healing our communities moving forward. So that's the lens by which I approached life and the work. And that allows me to safely go into communities who are experiencing a lot of trauma with an amazing team and help them move into a space of radical imagination, right? Help them move into, which also itself is a healing modality, right? So we forget our own creative process as a healing modality. So you stack functions there, so that we can imagine new futures together, right? So that we can move forward in the agency of healing. And that design just has a seat at the table. Design's not going to fix all the things, but without us, you ain't going to fix all the things, right? It's a biodiverse system. We are part of that system. We need to be able to participate in that system. And that's a whole other thing I'd go on about, but, getting ourselves clean, healthy, clear, so that we can be part of change.
That's really well said. I second all of that. And I think that one of the earlier things you said about ideation really resonates with me. I think it's easy to think that that I just created these companies and everything worked, but everything that I've ever been a part of starting, there was always a prototype first, and then it kind of led to the company as we learned over time. And I think that's a really important approach for anybody, young or old, is, you can never assume that we know what the problem is really. And we can never assume that the solution that we've identified is the right one. So I think coming at these challenges with the humble mindset and being willing to do that work, to first start with a prototype. With Change Labs, it started with an event in 2014 that we called Change Labs, but it was like a one-day event for entrepreneurs. And it was our way of just seeing who shows up. What are people interested in talking about? What are they saying that their problems are? And we ran those one-day events for 5 years. And at every single event, we collected hundreds of sticky notes on what people said their challenges were. And then it wasn't until we had that mapped out on a giant wall that we could see there's a real need for this according to the people that we want to serve. And that was when we evolved it into what it is today. And even with catapult design, I didn't just create it one day. It started as a subgroup of Engineers Without Borders, and it was called the Appropriate Technology Design Team. And we'd meet in the basement of the Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco. And we started working with different organizations, tried new things, and then that realization that, wow, this could be a full-time job. There's enough organizations out there that need engineering and design support that you could probably charge for this. Let's see how it works. So I think that willingness to approach problems with an open mind and to humble yourself and to really be willing to invest that time in exploring what is the problem I'm trying to solve. I think it's this, but I could be wrong. Maybe it's this, or maybe that problem isn't as relevant to the people that I think it's to. But there's that whole time of just investing in that messy process of figuring it out, what it is that needs to be done.
It's a great way to end, I think, from both of you. Thank you so much for that. I love the name Appropriate Design Group. Thank you both so much. I mean, it was a personal pleasure to be able to hear from both of you. I wish we had more time, but thank you.
If we have no hope, let's all sit down and give up. There are millions of excellent reasons to be pessimistic. That's why I suggested we should divorce hope from reason. Hope should be wild, irrational, and unreasonable. In every line I write, every word I speak, what I'm really saying is, we're not zero. You haven't defeated us.